Hello, I'm Ben Orchard.
And I'm Claire Fitzpatrick.
Welcome to Sword, Sorcery and Synthesizers, the 80s fantasy movie podcast. I'm coming to you from Adelaide.
And I'm in Brisbane.
But through the wonders of modern technology and the magic of Skype, we meet each week to discuss some beloved movie of a bygone era and see what lies behind the nostalgia. All right, Claire. Today I would like to talk about Phantom of the Opera, specifically the 1989 film adaptation of Phantom of the Opera, which features reincarnation, time travel, prophetic dreams, deals with the devil. There's a special guest appearance by Satan himself, or one of his minions at least, played by a dwarf. I think there's enough fantasy elements in this version that we can definitely count it as a fantasy film for the purposes of this podcast.
Definitely. I'm even surprised it's just considered horror. It's not just horror, it's fantasy.
Well, it's interesting that this is the version of Phantom of the Opera that actually contains bona fide supernatural elements. It's called Phantom of the Opera, but Gaston Leroux's original novel is not a ghost story. It's really more of a mystery story that sort of has hints of the supernatural, but every, weird and freaky thing that happens over the course of the narrative turns out to have a rational explanation at the end.
Because things have to have rational explanations. Although I still think having some creepy mask guy living under, an opera house with rats, that's totally rational and not creepy at all.
But, the ugly homeless dude squatting in the basement, stalking a teenage singer, that's all, theoretically possible. I think the main thing is that Gaston Leroux, his background was writing sort of detective stories. That was his jam. And the original novel is sort of structured like a detective story. There's a whole lot of, strange happenings at the opera house. And the fact that the Phantom is just an ordinary man, squatting in the basement isn't revealed until like halfway through the book. And the full extent of his origins isn't really revealed until the end of the book in the last few chapters. Well, I think that's probably why there hasn't really been many like faithful adaptations of the novel, why most of the adaptations of the novel that are out there have been rather loose adaptations, because the original novel is sort of structured as a mystery story, but most of the plot twists in the book everyone already knows just through a process of pop cultural osmosis of people, just word of mouth.
I think also a lot of the books written during that time were mystery. Mystery was such a very common genre for writers, but that's just not as exciting as it could be if it was like more horrific, more sinister, more supernatural. Got to be more than just a mystery, something else.
Well, I think that is the key to the tale's enduring appeal, is this sort of mixture of different genre elements, and that there are elements of mystery, of horror, of romance, all sort of thrown together into one story.
Yeah. I think so. A while ago, I mentioned the idea of like speculative fiction. So what people generally say is speculative, which does get people annoyed. It's like it's either fantasy or it's horror or it's sci-fi, but there's a speculative element to it, which means it has bits of everything. You speculate these things, you can't tell. So I think this is actually, Phantom is such a great example of a speculative fiction. You can only speculate what he's doing down there. Where did he come from? Does he have powers? We don't know.
I think perhaps another key to Phantom's appeal in terms of adaptations is the fact that it's in the public domain. This particular version of Phantom of the Opera came out in 1989, and in the 1980s, when Gaston Leroux's book had just entered the public domain, there was an explosion of different Phantom of the Opera adaptations. There was, most famously, there was the stage musical with music by Andrew Lloyd Webber, lyrics by Charles Hart and Richard Stilgoe, which took the West End and Broadway by storm and is still running. But he wasn't the only person to do a stage musical of Phantom of the Opera in the 80s. He wasn't even the first. There's at least two that I'm aware of that predate it. There was production by Ken Hill, which also incorporated like actual opera that was popular in the time period the story's set. There was also another more obscure production in development that was simply called Phantom and featured music and lyrics by Maury Yeston and a script by Arthur Coppett. And this version formed the basis for a television miniseries that happened. I can't remember if it was in 1989 or 1990, a television miniseries which featured Charles Dance as the Phantom. And that version has the unique distinction of being the only version to be filmed in Paris at the actual Paris Opera House. That version actually changed quite a bit of Gaston Leroux's novel. Probably the most faithful version was also made in the 1980s. There was a direct-to-video animated cartoon for kids. And when I say it was the most faithful version, it actually included the scene where Eric the Phantom has his rival, Christine's lover, Raoul, imprisoned in a torture chamber and tries to like roast him in a giant oven. It's there in the cartoon version. It's there in the cartoon version that was pitched at children. There were a lot of other adaptations. There was a 1993 TV movie featuring Maximilian Schell and Jane Seymour. The very year that the 1989, when the Robert Englund version came out to cinemas, there was also Phantom of the Mall, Eric's Revenge, and something called Phantom of the Ritz, which I've never seen those versions, but they're modernized adaptations. Sometime in the mid-80s, there was a Chinese film called Song at Midnight, which was kind of a remake of a 1930s Chinese adaptation of Phantom of the Opera. And that in itself was later remade in the 90s under the title The Phantom Lover. So yeah, there was lots and lots of Phantoms. There was a Phantom of the Opera pinball machine in the 80s as well. I remember as a kid going down to my local fish and chip shop, which was next to a video arcade, and asking my mum, "Oh, can I go and can I use the change? Can I go and play a bit of Phantom pinball?" Which brings us to the 1989 film with Robert Englund as the Phantom. This film was sort of, I'm inclined to think that maybe it was made to capitalize on the success of a bunch of things. As I was saying, the musical by Andrew Lloyd Webber and Charles Hart and Richard Stilgoe had just like taken the West End and Broadway by storm. But also around this time, like Robert Englund was at the height of his fame playing Freddy Krueger in the Nightmare on Elm Street series. And maybe they thought, wow, if we do a Phantom movie with Robert Englund, that's sure to draw a crowd.
I think it's such an interesting choice because when you mentioned Robert Englund, I was like, Freddy Krueger? And the fact that I thought of Freddy Krueger and not him as an actor and other things stood out to me because I thought, what if the directors have thought the same thing, that people are going to see, a poster of, this new Phantom movie coming out. Robert Englund? Isn't that Freddy Krueger?
Maybe in the casting agent's mind, they were thinking he's best known for playing a disfigured character in the Nightmare on Elm Street series. So what's another famous sort of disfigured character he could step into? He also achieved some measure of success in a TV miniseries called V, which was about aliens invading Earth. And he was one of the token good aliens, I believe. And again, the aliens look human on the outside, or they can disguise themselves as humans, but underneath they're these sort of reptilian creatures. So again, his other sort of famous role was again playing someone, who underneath his disguise looks ugly. Maybe what we're seeing is just typecasting in action.
Possibly, yeah, because it's just not someone that I would have thought to pick, but did a pretty good job without racing ahead. Yeah, I thought it was interesting choice.
Well, this film makes so many interesting choices in adapting the story to the screen. Can I just talk about the first 20 minutes of the film and just run through that, because it's sort of the setup for everything that follows?
Yeah.
I mean, the film opens with a shot of the New York City skyline in 1985, and then the title comes up, Gaston Leroux's The Phantom of the Opera, which is the most hilarious thing, because normally when they put the author's name above the title, like in the 90s with Bram Stoker's Dracula or Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, it's normally a marketing ploy to say, see, this version is more faithful than the others. But as you will see, this film, Gaston Leroux's The Phantom of the Opera, is actually one of the furthest removed from the book. And the fact that it opens with a shot of New York City in the 1980s is, yeah.
I actually thought that was quite funny, and I was just like, this is not intentional, but this would be hilarious if they were sitting around, the writer's room. Imagine if we did this. Imagine if you put it Gaston Leroux. Oh, that'd be hilarious, because it's clearly not.
But then what happens is we're introduced to Christine, who in this version is a struggling young singer trying to make it on Broadway in New York. And her best friend Meg is a librarian. And she's looking for an obscure piece of music to impress people at an audition. And she picks this piece by a composer named Eric Dessler, who was also a serial killer in 19th century London. And she thinks, well, this might get the director's attention. So she takes it to the audition and she sings her heart out. And then there's this unexpected accident. A sandbag falls on her head. And it affects her brain, and she starts having these dreams of a past life. And in her past life, Christine was a opera singer at the London Opera House in the 19th century. And she's the understudy to the diva La Carlotta. And she's also being tutored by this ethereal voice that she hears in her dressing room that claims to be her guardian angel. But it turns out her guardian angel is really Eric Dessler, a hideously disfigured homeless dude who is squatting in the basement and has been stalking her for quite a long time. Eric's background in this version, he wasn't deformed from birth like a lot of other phantoms are. This version of the Phantom was once an ordinary man, he was this struggling middle-aged composer who was approached by the devil, and he made a bargain: I'll sell my soul so that my music will live forever and be loved by millions. And the devil says, yes, I'll make it so your music is loved, but you never will be. So in addition to taking his soul, the devil mutilates Eric's face. And Eric is driven from polite society and, squats in the basement of the London Opera House working on his magnum opus, an opera about Don Juan. But he figures a way to sort of subvert the devil's curse. He becomes a serial killer. He skins his victim. And through a combination of prosthetics, skin grafts, and makeup, he fashions himself a new face. unlike a lot of other phantoms who just, content themselves with wearing a sort of plain white mask to hide their deformity, he literally makes himself a new skin. It disintegrates after a few days, so he has to keep killing people to get new skin. But
See, I loved it. Okay. Obviously, like, I love body horror things. I loved it. I thought this was really cool, really clever, also really stupid. But, him putting on, like, prosthetics and stuff, and I was like, yeah, you're not making yourself look like a man. And obviously he's going to wear this prosthetics so he can try and appear normal, quote unquote normal, blend into a crowd, no one can notice him. But I feel like he stood out even more.
I wonder if the uncanny nature of the makeup was intentional, though, because he still, when he goes out in public, even though he's got all these prosthetics on, sometimes he wears a scarf over his face. And also, like, he's still sort of self-consciously looking at himself in the mirror occasionally to see that it's not flaking or falling off. And also, there's various scenes where, like, the characters, like, he goes to a pub and some characters still sort of poke fun at him. Yeah. And there's another scene where he sleeps with a prostitute in this. And he is insistent, please leave the lights out. I don't want you to see my face. And he's doing this even though he has, like, the artificial, like, the stitched together prosthetic skin over him, over his deformity, to hide the full extent of his deformity. He's still saying to the prostitute, oh, keep the lights out. I don't want you to see me.
Yeah, he definitely looks creepy sitting like that. But I think it was either too on the fence. I wasn't sure if it was if it was trying to be more gory and not not meeting that mark, or if it was not trying to be that gory, but then the weird prosthetics made it look too gory, so it didn't meet the mark there.
I'm going to be generous and say I think that was the point. I think they wanted it to look uncanny. They wanted to reinforce the fact that no matter what he does to himself, he's never going to look completely normal. He's never going to truly subvert the devil's curse.
Yeah.
And
that makes sense.
He's never going to be able to assimilate into society.
I don't know if it's because I've been, in the office working on my thesis, but this just makes me think of Frankenstein. Of that character who has been either created or has some kind of deformity or something that is never actually going to be able to be part of society, and is always going to be kind of relinquished to the shadows and can try and try and try, but it's never just not going to be accepted.
That plays into not only, the horror of when he's lashing out at the people who are laughing at him, like some, yobs that accost him in the pub and try to mug him in an alleyway afterwards. Yeah. And, he lashes out with rage at them, not just because, they were trying to steal from him, but also, like, because of the way they reacted to his face. But, well, and also because, he could use some extra skin for his next set of skin grafts, I guess. But it also plays into the scenes where he finally musters up the courage to just stop stalking Christine and just approach her and try to, seduce her and reveal to her that, like, all this time I said that I was your guardian angel. I lied to you. I'm just a man, an ugly older man who is insanely in love with you.
I know it's going to seem weird, but I did feel a sense of sincerity to that. And of, I'm just a man, I may look like this, but I'm just someone who has a passion for you. You don't know who I am. I'm this freak who loves you, but I know we keep saying that the Phantom is this crazy stalker. But for me, in this instance, because he tried so hard to look so quote unquote normal, because he tried so hard to assimilate and fit into society, I was kind of like rooting for him. I was kind of like, he's doing so well. And I don't know, like I think that kind of took away some of the creepiness factor. Does that make sense?
Really, that's interesting to hear you say that. I mean, I think it does the opposite, because the thing is, in the novel and in most other adaptations, the Phantom is, or Eric is his real name. Eric is deformed from birth and has spent his whole life, abused by his parents, sold into a carnival, exhibited as a freak, treated as an outcast all his life before, moving to the opera house, and is completely socially maladjusted as a result. And it doesn't excuse the fact that he murders innocent people whenever he's enraged. The fact that he, stalks Christine, he lies to her, he manipulates her, he threatens her, he's domineering and controlling. All of these things that make it quite right for her to reject his advances, despite what, a lot of fan fiction writers say that sort of pair them off. But the reason a lot of fan fiction writers, I think, make excuses for Eric is because in the novel they feel sorry for him because of his childhood, because of his background. The Phantom in this version doesn't have that sort of Freudian excuse of a terrible childhood, a terrible background, a life as an outcast. There was, like, until he sold his soul to the devil, aged 40-something, he was completely normal. And a lot of the killings that he does in this movie are calculated, and they're motivated, for selfish reasons, for vanity, basically. He doesn't have to do all this, so he doesn't have the excuses that sort of make it so easy for other adaptations and other sort of, I don't know, fan communities of other versions of the Phantom story to romanticize the character.
And that's something that I thought was extremely interesting. And actually, that's one of the most interesting things that I took away from this, is because when you think of the Phantom, you're like, okay, this is something that, it happened to him. He's disfigured through whatever means. He did not disfigure himself. So we pity him, even though we're like, hey, you're a bit of a creep. Stop stalking this chick. We're like, all right, you should probably go to therapy. But it wasn't his choice. He can make this choice to be disfigured. Whereas in this version, Eric, by making this kind of Faustian deal, he needs to just suffer the consequences. I don't know. Like, it was just like, well, what did you think was going to happen? And I just found it incredibly just different. It was just telling a completely different kind of story. If you know what I mean, like having different background, having a different backstory, changed his personality, changed for me, like, his whole purpose.
I've heard fans of the 1989 version make the argument that this film was an attempt to reclaim the Phantom for the horror genre after many other adaptations that emphasized the romantic elements so much that it just stopped being scary anymore. I mean, the main example being the Andrew Lloyd Webber musical, or for that matter, the Maury Yeston musical. They both sugarcoat the story a great deal. And a lot of people who only know the story through those musicals regard it as a love story more than a horror story. I think, I can't remember again if it was 1989 or 1990. A book came out called simply Phantom by Susan Kay, which is like the mother of all Phantom of the Opera fan fiction. Like, before the internet, there was Susan Kay, and in this version, in that version, spoilers, the Phantom, gets to have sex with Christine, and she has his child, and it's become a staple of like Phantom of the Opera fan fiction ever since. And even when Andrew Lloyd Webber decided to do a sequel to his musical called Love Never Dies, he incorporated a lot of these fanfic elements, like, Christine sleeping with the Phantom and having a child by him. And so there's also like the 1940s film of Phantom of the Opera with Claude Rains and the the 1983 one with Maximilian Schell and Jane Seymour, they're quite romanticized in their way as well. This version is straight up horror, and it seems to be going out of its way to sort of emphasize the fact that the Phantom is a villain. He's not someone that you should like. He's not someone whose actions you should condone. I mean, it's a lot harder to create sort of cuddly fan fiction based on this Phantom than it is with, say, the stage musical versions.
I think it's interesting because, like, it's clearly trying to be faithful to the original kind of story. Like, it has, I'm pretty sure it has, like, some elements that others don't. So it's got, that the theatre is putting on a production of, like, Faust and stuff like that.
The odd thing about this version, even though it's set in London and New York at different time periods, and it includes, like, reincarnation as a plot point and all these other things, even though it includes all these elements, in some ways it tries to be more true to the tone of the book. Being this dark mystery story with horror elements. And it does include various scenes from the book that a lot of other adaptations skip over, like the opera company putting on a production of Faust, like Eric showing up in the guise of Edgar Allan Poe's The Red Death at the masquerade ball, him playing the violin to serenade Christine in a graveyard. And my favorite is a scene where Eric has abducted Christine and taken her down to his lair, and he's sitting down at his organ, about to play a piece of music, and he says to Christine, like, this is either a wedding march or a funeral mass. You decide. Basically, marry me or die.
Pretty much. So it's like, but like, I love that aspect to it. So I love that it has this mixture of actual very faithful things and then other things that are clearly, like, created. But I think it actually kind of works. But this is why I'm really conflicted with what I think about this film, because I think there are so many elements of it that, taken from the source material from the book, it's like, wow, this is a really, really great job. And other elements that seemed, I think, more like prosthetics and things that just didn't really work for me. But I also love that it had a lot of opera, because when you think about it, like, it had a lot of lovely performances, or it had a lot of lovely dramatic scenery, and where some other versions that I've seen doesn't actually have a lot of opera in it. It's just about Christine and the opera house. Whereas I loved this had it. It's it was quite nice.
Yes, if you're a fan of Charles Gounod's, I think that's how it's pronounced, Charles Gounod's production of Faust. If you're a fan of Faust, then there's some wonderfully staged, like, show within a show moment here. Nancy Fontane is the singing voice of Christine. Jill Schoelen is the sort of the main actress who plays Christine, but Nancy Fontane does her singing voice, and she has the exquisitely pure soprano voice. You can see why Eric is so enamored with her, and so obsessed with furthering her career at all costs.
Beautiful, and, like, I think you've got that element of beauty in it as well, and because he's so enamored by her, and it makes sense. Like, seems weird because, like, I actually didn't really think a lot about the actual opera in the film The Opera, where in this version I really took notice of it, and I really took notice of the music, and I don't know why, because it just seemed to stand out more than the other versions that I've seen, and I've seen a lot of different versions now. I like that.
I think it's a point of emphasis in the sense that a lot of other productions skim over Eric's tuition of Christine, or Christine training her voice and preparing to perform. Like the fact that, the opening scenes in New York where Christine is getting ready for an audition and going through the grind of being a working artist. Like, this is something that is not emphasized in most versions. The emphasis in this production that being a working artist is sometimes real hard work, and you have to prepare and you have to train. Like, amidst all the fantastical elements that are included in this, like Christine having these prophetic dreams that she knows Eric's song that he's written for the opera before he's even played it because she's heard it in her dream. Despite including all these fantastical elements, it includes all these sort of grounded practical elements of what life is like as a working artist. And that's an interesting dimension to this version for sure.
Yeah. And I actually really like that because it's something that we don't really talk about. Everyone's like, let's go off and, get an arts degree. Let's become an actor. Let's become an author, and it's going to be amazing and beautiful. And we're going to have all these friends and this success, notoriety. And it often doesn't happen that way. Or you do become successful, but in your own way. And I actually really liked that this had a more nuanced kind of underlying of reality. It seemed this is going to sound really weird to say that this film is more grounded in reality than the other Phantom, but because clearly not. But when it came to actually life as an opera singer, in day-to-day life, I thought this is actually pretty good. It's actually showing more about her and her struggles that she would inherently have even before being pursued by, the creepy guy.
And like a part of that is like the scenes that they include with Christine rehearsing and preparing and going to an archive to look for obscure compositions to impress people at an audition. It's something that like a lot of people I know who are musical theatre performers actually do that. I want to touch upon Jill Sherellin's performance, which is sort of quite underrated, I think. In the pantheon of screen and stage actors who've played Christine, I don't think she usually gets brought up as a sort of favorite. But I think she really sells the fact that Christine has a passion for music and a passion for performing that I think in many ways what comes through in this movie is that her love for music is something that drives her, something that she feels more strongly about than her love for her sort of fiance who's named Richard in this, or even like the feelings that she has for Eric that are sort of conflicted in the sense that he's a mentor that has inspired her, but he's also a violent psychopath whose notions of love are very domineering and possessive, to say the least. But the other thing I should say that Jill Sherellin does, which I think is wonderful, is she plays a character who is naive and innocent socially, but still is intelligent, has a sense of like intuitive smart to her, and never comes across as an airhead or a doormat. It's very difficult sometimes to play a character that is like genuinely naive and innocent and have them not come across as stupid.
Yeah, and like I genuinely wanted her to succeed. Like I wanted her as Christine to be able to I guess get through all this, because sometimes I think often we have like heroines who they're being, pursued by the evil baddie and stuff. And sometimes it's like, well, you're not that interesting. Like, you're just not, I don't know, but in this, I really wanted Christine to succeed in opera because she was so cheery. She's so delightful. She's so, she has this kind of like childlike quality to her that not creepy, not saying like childlike in like a bad way, but she just had that optimism, that youthful optimism that I thought was really different to other versions that I've seen. And yeah, like I thought she was really, really cheery, and I really liked that different side of Christine, because Christine goes through all these issues, but Jill seems to actually,
she goes through a lot of potentially traumatizing events, to be sure, and it's easy to sort of play up the angst of the character in that regard. A lot of other adaptations do. I think the main thing is in a lot of really bad slasher films that were made in the 1980s, I kept thinking of these scream queens, these final girls, who somehow survived to the end of the movie, despite me constantly shouting at the screen, why are you doing this stupid thing that's endangering yourself? And the thing is, when I was watching Jill Sherellin as Christine in this, I was never thinking that. I was never thinking, don't be so stupid.
No.
Like, she always came across as doing, like, the intelligent and reasonable thing.
Yeah. And I just thought she was just a good kind of like character. Like she, obviously the film is this, this demented kind of like balancing thing. We got like the stage, the musical kind of thing, and then slasher film, like, molded together. And but the thing is, I think if someone else had played it, like maybe it wouldn't have been as good. But she does seem like one of those original kind of scream queen that kind of been overlooked. Makes sense.
I'm not familiar with her wider body of work. I know the other role that she's most famous for is the original, The Stepfather.
Yeah.
Another sort of stalker thriller movie. And yeah, I'm surprised based on what little I've seen of her that she didn't become a bigger star. Based on what I've seen of her, she's quite a nuanced actress. But them's the breaks, I guess.
And again, I think that also shows that, yeah, like this is an underrated kind of film, specifically when it comes to phantom films. But I thought her performance itself definitely merits it being much higher because she does a really good job.
I think that Robert Englund's performance has also been a bit underrated, probably because of his association with Freddy Krueger and people looking to draw parallels between his depiction of Krueger and the Phantom.
Yeah.
Mostly how much more violent or sort of blatantly violent this version of the Phantom is. And his tendency to sort of toss off quips as he's killing people, I guess it is comparable to Freddy Krueger. But in most other respects, I'd say this is a very different characterization. I thought that Englund sort of, in the scenes where he was required to project romantic yearning for Shirellen, and the scenes where he's required to sort of project, passion for art, for music itself, I found those moments just as convincing as the scenes where he's waving a knife around threateningly.
I actually liked when in the scenes where we're just kind of like learning more about Eric's character, just learning more about him. And when he's, not going out there killing people, when he's just interacting with people, like interacting with kind of strangers. And I think, trying to face the adversary of having this kind of crazy mental face, his mask and stuff like that. And I actually think Robert Englund's playing it made it seem so creepy, but he just did it in such a really good way. Hang on. I need to re-say that. I'm just trying to think of a way to say it
I think the words you might be looking for are layered. I think his interpretation of the Phantom is much more layered and nuanced than people tend to give him credit for. I'm thinking a few scenes stand out for me. One is the scene where Christine is performing in Faust, and Eric is sitting in box 5 at the Opera House watching her perform, and it cuts back and forth between showing her performance and his reaction to it. The way that he's sort of almost giddy with joy as he watches Christine reach all the high notes that they've trained for. And another scene where, as you mentioned, the graveyard scene where he's serenading Christine and then takes her back to his lair and talks to her about this composition that he's writing. And in that moment, it doesn't seem like he's just saying this to impress Christine romantically. Like, he is reaching out to her as an artist. And that's quite a powerful scene, and it shows that there's a bit more depth to him.
I think also there's the scenes when he's, being the, I guess, typical slasher villain of killing people, right? It weirdly seems some more depth to him as well, because he doesn't just kill people at will, like by random. And he seems to sort of subvert this kind of classic slasher killer that he's just going to kill these people just because he wants to, get Christine. He's going to wreak his, revenge and anger on all these people. I think this film really showed that the potential that he had to live this normal, non-murderous life. But he was corrupted by his greed to become this amazing musician and the Faustian deal.
Well, there's flashbacks to when he was an ordinary musician, just this jobbing musician. And again, like Englund plays him as this kind of, geeky but enthusiastic, aspiring artist.
Yeah.
And again, it's a very different side to him than people might expect. And later in the movie, when Eric is reincarnated in the future and we see him in New York, he's got more modern technological methods of covering his deformity. In the modern sections in New York where Eric has been reincarnated and he sort of reinvented himself as this Broadway impresario, this director. And it turns out that he was the director of the show that Christine was auditioning for at the start. And he tries to entrap her again, the future incarnation of Christine in New York. And you see him, be more subtly manipulative and seductive in those sequences. And actually sort of try to win her over with his charm rather than like threatening to kill her straight away if she doesn't marry him. And he manages to like project a sort of dapper charm in those scenes as well.
Yeah, well, I like that this version kind of made Eric like an actual person who he weirdly had his own set of standards as well. Like he's actually trying to win her over. He's actually trying to convince her of his moral high standing, I suppose, of him, of his worthiness, I think. And obviously, he is a monster, I guess. But it actually made me think about like more about, he's not incredibly disfigured. Why is he remaining the monster? Like, is he really a monster? Like, is it only because obviously his deformity is, pretty dark, pretty creepy and stuff. But, I was really interested in learning more about him as what made him monstrous, especially in like the future. Like
that I'm reminded, listening to you say that, I'm reminded of a lyric that I think Charles Hart wrote for the more famous musical version, where Christine explains to Eric why she's rejecting him. And she sings, "It's not in your face, but in your soul that the true distortion lies."
Yeah.
And ultimately, I think what makes him monstrous is not so much his looks as his actions. And the way that, despite all of the terrible things that have happened to him, I mean, he remains a very selfish person. A person whose ideals of love are very sort of possessive and domineering, and someone who is ruthless in going after what they want and sees people as pawns that they can sort of sacrifice or manipulate at will to achieve their goals. And I think that's what makes the Phantom monstrous, not just his looks. That is why Christine rejects him. I don't want to belabor this point too much, but let's just say, during the early days of the internet, there was quite a lot of fan fiction written on various websites like fanfiction.net that sort of, I don't know, misunderstood this point, that presented the Phantom as a romantic figure and tried to like set Eric up with Christine to live happily ever after together. And that never really sat right with me. Although I can see why people like would romanticize the character because of his sort of pitiable background.
I was going to say that I like that they didn't do this. Like, I like that he does a lot of actual monstrous things and you don't pity him. I mean, I certainly didn't. I mean, like, he kidnaps her in the lair and like, he attempts to rape Christie. Says you can never leave, we're gonna lock you in here. They've got police coming after them in the sewers and everything like that, and it's more monstrous, and it's creepy, and it's violent, and it's definitely not romantic in any way.
Although this version does have like all the trappings of a period film that you'd expect. The sets and the costumes are all very ornate and, eye-catching. The cinematography is supremely elegant. The score is very lush and sweeping and grandiose, and incorporates like various sort of opera music as well.
It's like beautiful and gory at the same time, and it's like it's a very odd mixture of that, beauty and the grotesque. I think that the amalgamation of both of those kind of things, which I think it may be why some people do and don't like it. I think like some people think that it's too gory or not gory enough, or the mixture is too odd.
I think perhaps the fact that it didn't do that well at the box office and didn't sit well with critics at the time may be just, as you said, it's this mixture of different elements that a lot of people thought didn't gel well.
But I think this is like an issue that happens with adaptation. But like, I think that it still had, I guess, it was still faithful to the essence of the Phantom, which is, yes, he is hideous, but not just because he's deformed, but because he's horrible. Like, he's just horrible things. And I think it doesn't really matter where it's set and what you add to it. I still think it had that faithfulness of his character and of his true personality, of his nature. So I think I really liked the added this, having like the 80s elements of it and moving it. And while it's not my favorite Phantom film, I really, really do like it. And I really do like it because it was different, because it has subverted expectations. And yeah, I think it was very faithful.
Well, I think perhaps another reason it didn't do so well was maybe Phantom fatigue. Like,
possibly
there were like 3 different stage musicals of Phantom of the Opera in the 80s. There was the TV movie, there was the cartoon, there was a couple of other modern adaptations. So maybe just people had enough Phantom by that point. They were like, oh, another one. I've returned to this movie often because I'm so in love with the visual aesthetic. The cinematography and the sets and costumes are so elegant and beautiful, both in the London and New York scenes. I really love Jill Sherellen's interpretation of Christine, the balance of intelligence and naivete, the balance of vulnerability and strength in her performance. And I love Robert Englund, the combination of like romantic yearning and violent ruthlessness in his Phantom. I love those things. The goofy elements like the skin grafts and the sort of reincarnation and the Faustian bargains, all of that weird stuff makes it like it might not work, but I find it compelling anyway. And like, this is one of those films where I'm reminded of this quote by Voltaire. I think it was by Voltaire, who said, "Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good." Because this movie isn't perfect, but it has enough good elements that I keep coming back to it. It's so compelling.
I think that's another thing that I love about it. And it's something that I said about so many movies that we watched and so many different versions of the same theme. So we've seen so many different versions of Phantom. I've seen so many different versions of, like Frankenstein. And might have so many good elements. It doesn't need to be perfect, but it's got enough good elements there that it is just right and it works, even if it's so bizarre, which his film is very bizarre. But it works because it has all the elements there of the classic fantasy kind of horror story.
That's all for this week, folks. Thanks for listening. If you like what we're doing, please consider subscribing and sharing this podcast with your friends. If you have any questions or would like to provide suggestions for future episodes, you can send an email to fantasypodcastfeedback@gmail.com. Until next time, cheers.